everyone, I'm Kelly Kobe. I'm an investigator in the Centre for Journalology here in Ottawa. I want to take a minute and welcome you and thank you for attending our session today. So this is the second session in our annual speaker series for this year. And today we're going to be speaking about open access. How is Canada doing? I'm really looking forward to this session because I think that there's a lot of room for discussion in terms of what we're currently doing and what we ought to be doing in terms of open access in this country. And I'm really keen to hear our speakers' perspectives on how we compare globally to other jurisdictions. Before jumping in and introducing our speakers for the day, I want to briefly mention our Centre for Journalology and sort of our remit and talk a little bit about what we do for those of you who are not as familiar with the Centre. So as I mentioned, we're based in Ottawa in Canada at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute. You can learn more about us on our Centre webpage, which you see there, or by following our Twitter page. But briefly, we conduct research on a ranging number of topics, including things like predatory journals, which relate a little bit to our discussion today on open access. Also, we look at things like incentives and rewards in academia, reproducibility, as well as developing and evaluating reporting guideline checklists. Beyond this sort of research arm of what we do, our Centre is also quite active creating educational content and resources for researchers in order to help support them meet what we think are sort of journalology or publication best practices. So if this sort of aspect of what we do interests you, I'd encourage you to check out the Journalology Resources tab of our website, and you can see a screenshot of that there on the slide. Okay, so without further ado, really pleased to have two external speakers joining us today. So today we have Dr. Michael Donaldson and Dr. Monica Granados, who will be speaking, as I said, about open access and how Canada is doing. I'm going to jump right in and introduce Dr. Michael Donaldson. He'll be the first speaker in the session, and then Dr. Granados will follow him. And then we'll have a bit of a Q&A. So I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting questions and things that come up throughout the session. So stay online, and when the talks are done, we can have an opportunity to engage and discuss with one another. So Dr. Donaldson is the Open Access Program Manager at Canadian Science Publishing. Prior to this role, he held roles as Managing Editor and Content Development Manager at Canadian Science Publishing. He has over 15 years of experience in scholarly research and has held research and graduate appointments at the University of Illinois, the University of British Columbia, and Carleton University, where he's currently an adjunct professor. So really interested to hear, Dr. Donaldson, your perspective on open access through the lens of a publisher and a journal perspective.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Michael Donaldson, and I'm the Open Access Program Manager at Canadian Science Publishing. And I'll be focusing a bit more on the journals and the publications in Canada that are exploring open access. I'll be talking a little bit about the context of the open access and open science movements, both globally and nationally as well. But I'll be focusing a bit on open access and the transition that many publishers are starting to do now to look into transitioning their journals to open access. So to begin, I'll just give a little bit of an overview on open science and open access. And as many of us know, open science is certainly a very broad term that's covering a number of different aspects of the research enterprise. So it's everything from open data, open source software, open infrastructures, open evaluation when it comes to tenure and promotion activities, open education, openness to knowledge diversity, including traditional or indigenous knowledge, or incorporating citizen science into research practices. And open science also involves open access as well, and that, of course, is referring to access to journals and journal content, or open access to books and book content as well. So I'll be focusing a little bit more on the open access side today, but I'll be touching a bit on open science and open data in a few other areas of the presentation as well. Now, in terms of some recent global open science developments, at the moment, UNESCO is developing their recommendation on open science, and a recommendation is what's considered a standard setting instrument for the different member states that are part of UNESCO. So that includes developing principles and best practices that can be implemented by the different member states in their own open science related policies. So that document has been going through some consultation with various stakeholder groups, including the different member states. And I think they're currently developing the second revision to that document, which will be available in the next month or so. So be interested to see what the final document looks like for that, because it definitely has implications for open access and other aspects of open science at a global scale. And I think it'll be very informative for Canada to be able to look at some of those principles and practices and make sure that we're in line with them when we're developing our own federal policies. Also, open science is one of the Hong Kong principles. So the Hong Kong principles were proposed in 2020, and they were put forward as a way of assessing researchers in a fair and transparent manner. And the idea was that there should be recognition for author behaviors that foster research integrity, and open science is certainly key to that. For example, open data, making sure your research is accessible, the research methods are accessible as well, and there should be recognition and reward for authors to be following along with those principles. So this idea of transparency is certainly key, and I think open science is an essential aspect of that for sure. One other major initiative that actually just took place last month was Plan S. So Plan S is a proposal that was put forward by an organization called Coalition S, and it essentially requires all published research by certain funders, predominantly in Europe, to be made fully open access at the time of publication, so with no embargo period. And it took effect January 1st. There had been consultation for the past 2 or 3 years on the concepts behind it, but it's certainly something that has sent some shock waves through the publishing industry in many ways. And I think that was really part of the intention behind Plan S, was really to get people thinking about the transition to open access and moving there at an accelerated pace. So partly because of Coalition S coming into effect and Plan S taking effect, over the past few years, and really just even in the past few months, we've seen a number of publishers at a global scale adopting what's called transformative open access approaches. So that means that journals that were traditionally subscription-based are transitioning over to a fully open access business model. And it started off kind of slow, but it's really been gaining momentum now, and there's over 225 major agreements that have been registered on a site that tracks those. However, they are mostly with the larger publishers, larger commercial publishers, and many of the smaller publishers haven't followed suit yet, but it's certainly an indication that open access is going to be a big part of the publishing future. And I think Plan S has really done a lot to accelerate the pace of that change. So although Plan S has really accelerated this move towards open access, it's been a bit of a long process, really, that open access has become more and more predominant in the scholarly publishing world. And really the first mention of the phrase open access was actually back about 20 years ago in 2002 at the Budapest Open Access Initiative. That's where the term was sort of coined and popularized. And since that time, we've actually seen quite a bit of growth in terms of OA book publishing, OA journal publishing, and journal publishers as well. And we've also seen the rise of the open access mega journals. So PLOS One, which is well established now, and a number of other newer open access mega journals that have been published since PLOS One came on the scene. And now those journals are the ones that publish by far the highest publication volume really of any journal out there. So they in effect, those mega journals have sort of taken over the publishing world. So along with this proliferation of new open access journals have come some new terminology, and one aspect is how those journals are paid for. So it's a bit of a different model compared to the traditional subscription model. For OA journals, typically there's some sort of fee that's coming from the author or from their institution as part of the payment. So there's the gold open access route, and that usually relies on an article processing charge model. So it can be an author paid or author's institution paid model. It also generally enables the author to make their article available immediately upon publication, and it typically includes a fairly liberal copyright license. So typically the industry standard is a CC-BY 4.0 license that accompanies the publication of that paper. There's also been a real growth of open access repositories, and green OA usually refers to the ability that an author has to make a version of their paper. It's typically the accepted version, so not the final version of record, but the accepted version of their paper can be made freely accessible through an open access repository that allows anyone to access it. And we've seen quite a bit of growth in that front, because that was something that was proposed many years ago to comply with funder requirements. And we at CSP, the company I work for, we've seen quite a bit of growth there in terms of the number of authors that are interested in posting their papers in open access repositories. And there's no fee associated with that, so it's certainly one way to comply with no additional cost to the researcher. There's also another option called Bronze Open Access, and that's where content is made free to read and it's also free to publish. And that is a little bit different from the gold and the green options, but it does enable content to get out there at no additional cost to the author. So as you can imagine, as open access has evolved over the past, say, 20 plus years, we've seen quite a bit of growth in the amount of content that is now available as open access. And on this graph, I'm showing content and I'm calling it accessible rather than open access because it combines data that sort of covers those three different areas that I mentioned, the gold open access, the green open access, the bronze open access, really any content that can be accessed in one way or another. So not purely gold open access, but kind of open access across the board. So that would even include papers that maybe are published in 1 year and not made accessible until the next year, if there's an embargo period, for example. So if you look back at 2010, you can see that at that time, about 2/3 of the content that was published in terms of the number of articles published were made closed. So they were held behind a paywall. They were not freely accessible by anyone unless you had a subscription to that journal content. And about 1/3 of that content was made accessible. So it was either free or could be made or was made open access. Now, if you fast forward over time, you can see from about 2015 to 2020, there's fairly steady growth in terms of the amount of content that was actually made accessible. And by 2020, the latest data just from the end of last year, we're almost at the 50-50 mark, which is quite amazing that the amount of content that's out there is 50% of it can be accessed without requiring a subscription. So I think that really shows that open access has become such a predominant model, and it's something that researchers have really taken the time to invest in terms of seeing the value of it and making their content open. So it's quite an interesting trend. And I think, it won't be long now with Plan S and some of these other international movements. I'm sure we'll get to the point where we're moving beyond that 50% mark and switching over to having even more content being accessible. Now, in Canada, we've seen a number of recent open access and open science developments, and one of the major ones was actually back in 2015, and CIHR had even started this prior to that, but it's the Tri-Agency Open Access Policy, and what that does is it requires any author that's funded through the tri-agencies to make the research paper available within 1 year of publication. And I think that has really brought Canada in line with what a number of other national funders had been doing, and it really helped to increase the amount of open access content that was coming out of Canada. Also, we're seeing that the Federal Open Science Roadmap, which was proposed by the Office of the Chief Science Advisor last year, it actually came out just a few weeks before the pandemic hit, so the timing wasn't ideal, and some of the timelines associated with the roadmap have been pushed back because of the pandemic. But essentially what the roadmap does is it lays out a set of principles and concepts that each of the federal government research departments can consider when they're developing their own departmental policies when it comes to open science. So it's focused more on the federal government, but it also does have some implications for academic researchers as well. And I think that this document will actually really set the stage for open science in Canada over the next few years. Also, this document combined with that UNESCO document, the recommendation on open science that I mentioned earlier, I think between these two guiding documents, we have two very strong principle documents that will really help to develop principles at the departmental level within the government, which will be very effective, I think, for promoting open science. We've also seen quite a bit of open access infrastructure development in Canada. For example, Coalition Publica, which is a partnership between Erudit and the Public Knowledge Project, PKP, and their OJS, or Open Journal Systems platform. It's an infrastructure that has been proposed. It enables the publication of content as open access for the social sciences and humanities. It's been a really strong undertaking, and it's something that has been very effective, I think. And they actually just recently received funding to continue supporting Coalition Publica for the next 3 years. The funding came from SSHRC. So I think that's something that is really going to be beneficial to the social sciences journal community going forward, and just to be able to make more content open access. Also, there's OpenAIR and CARL have a collaboration. So OpenAIR is an open access infrastructure that was put forward by the European Commission, and it's geared towards tracking the number of papers that are published as open access and providing data in terms of what content is made open access. And the CARL, which is the Canadian Association of Research Libraries, they've been partnering with OpenAIR for the past couple of years to bring in the Canadian perspective to that infrastructure as well, which is great to see. In terms of open data, in Canada, we have Canary, and we also have Research Data Canada, with two organizations that are really geared towards promoting open data and best standards and best practices for open data. There's also a forthcoming tri-agency data policy as well, and that's something that is in the works, and I think it should be published soon. And I think much like the tri-agency open access policy, I think that data policy will be really beneficial to Canadian researchers as well, both at the government level, but also at the academic researcher level also. And in terms of open access publishing in Canada, we have a number of journal publishers and book publishers. There's actually hundreds of scholarly journals in Canada. Many of those are OA, at least in part, some in full. And really, the open access publishing is, in some respects, it could be considered as part of the scholarly research infrastructure. And that's something that I don't think we've really considered too much. But when we're talking about open access and the ability to make research more widely available to anyone that wants it, I think we really are talking about an infrastructure. So even scholarly publishers and scholarly journals themselves could be considered as part of this broader open access infrastructure. And if we do go that route, it does raise some new questions about how we can fund open access publishing. And that's a question that is certainly a challenge for many of us that are developing new models for open access and trying to find ways to promote open access and promote journal content in that transition from subscription to open access content. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about Canadian science publishing. And for those of you that don't know, CSP is Canada's largest not-for-profit scholarly publisher. So we publish international science, technology, and engineering journals across a range of disciplines. And as a not-for-profit, we're mission-driven. So our mission is we're champions of scientific knowledge exchange, and we're committed to strengthening the integrity, relevance, and reach of science. And for us, we really want to ensure that scientific knowledge is published in a high quality format. It's easy to discover, easy to use, and easy to share. And I think open access is a key element of that vision. So this is just a quick schematic of our 24 journals that we publish across those different scientific disciplines. And I just want to draw your attention to 3 titles in particular that are open access titles. So Facets is one that we launched a few years ago now, and it's really Canada's first and only open access multidisciplinary science journal, covering all different disciplines. It's very integrative in approach, and there's a few subject areas that are really geared towards supporting integrative sciences, topics like science and communication, science and policy, science and education. So we launched that journal back in 2016. And also, prior to that, in 2015, we launched our first open access title, which is Arctic Science, and that's focusing on science and engineering related topics in the northern polar regions. We also most recently launched Anthropocene Coast, and it's a multidisciplinary science journal. It's related to anthropogenic effects on coastal regions. So in 2020, we launched our open access roadmap. As I mentioned, open access is something that has been a key priority for us. It aligns well with our values at CSP, and it's something that we've really been wanting to explore beyond just the 3 journals that are fully open access. We're interested in really expanding our open access portfolio. So in 2019, CSP launched our open access program. And the purpose of that program is to investigate business models to support our 3 existing open access journals, the ones that I mentioned on the previous slide, but also to explore the transition of hybrid journals to a fully open access model. So what we found in our initial scoping exercise was 5 criteria for really effective models. We wanted to find a model that was robust, sustainable, simple, scalable, and flexible. And we've been exploring different models that can meet these criteria and having discussions with different partners and developing some pilots to be able to assess which models work the best. One thing that we found so far is that there's really no one perfect model to rule them all. There's a number of different models, each have their strengths and weaknesses, and that seems to be the case that I'm noticing across the entire publishing landscape, where publishers are setting up different models depending on who they're partnering with and tailoring each model to the needs of their specific partner. So one of the challenges, but it's also an opportunity to be able to develop a model that really works well for a partner. And I think in doing so, it makes that model more likely to succeed over a longer term and be sustainable. So since our program launched in 2019, we began by doing some background research, really investigating the different types of open access models that were out there and most prevalent, and doing an analysis to see how those different models would work best for CSP and for our prospective partners. So we began by exploring an open access partnership model, which would be designed to support our existing open access journals, where institutions sort of partner with us to enable their authors to publish as fully open access in those journals. And since then, we've actually been exploring more on the transformative model approach. So we from discussions with a number of different partners, we saw that there was a real appetite for the transformative models, and that was really where we were keen to explore as well. So we're currently in the process of working with some partners to develop some transformative models that we'll hopefully implement as early as this year and over the next few years, and do some pilot projects to be able to explore how those could work both at a smaller scale and at a larger scale. So we're really keen to move forward with those. And of course, longer term, the transformative models are kind of a stepping stone, but we do envision a future where we're publishing fully open access journals, and we're really keen to be able to explore models that begin to get us closer and closer to that fully permanent open access model option. And that's a challenge. I think it's a challenge for all scholarly publishers at the moment, but it's something that I think is the writing's on the wall that publishing is moving towards open access and moving there very quickly. So it's there's a lot of opportunity, I think, now to be able to find a model that works longer term. So we're keen to test out these pilots and see how we can tweak those models and learn from them, and get to a point where we can be fully and permanently open access. So in terms of what the future holds for open access, I think the drive to open access is clear. We see that trend of increasing open access over time. I think what we really see is that movements like Plan S are very rapidly accelerating the number of journals that are transitioning towards open access. It's still going to take some time. Obviously, it's something that can't change overnight, but the pace of change now is so much higher than it had been even a few years ago. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. If anything, I think it's going to accelerate faster and faster towards an open access future. So certainly within Canada as well, we see there's a great deal of national momentum. You think of our open science roadmap, you think of the policies that have been put forward for open access and open data, and these infrastructures that are developing around those policies. There's an awful lot going on in terms of open access and open science in Canada. And as Canada's largest scholarly publisher, we see ourselves as really being key to moving some of those initiatives forward, and that's why we're keen to support this open access program and really keen to experiment and pilot out different types of open access models to find something that will work for us long term, that can be sustainable and effective. So at CSP, we see open access as an opportunity. As I mentioned, it's a real chance for us to be able to fulfill our company mission. As a not-for-profit, being mission-driven, we want to be able to increase the relevance and reach of our science, and how better to do that than through open access. It also allows us to fulfill our vision as well, which is empowering everyone with scientific knowledge. If we can tear down the barriers to accessing content, I think that really helps to accomplish that. So we're committed. We welcome this shift. It's been a bit of a change. Certainly, Plan S has really kind of turned the publishing world on its head a little bit, which is a challenge, but it's an opportunity. And we really want to be able to move with this change and be part of it, remain at the forefront of it, and really start to really turn the dial on open access. So we're excited to experiment and identify with different types of business models, trying to find something that's robust and sustainable. And I think our pilot projects that we're developing at the moment will really help us to get there. Ultimately, we really want to be able to offer our partners an integrated and robust, sustainable open access solution. That's the key thing for us. We really want to make sure that the research we're publishing is the highest quality research, and open access doesn't change that by any means. If anything, it kind of opens up more doors for that content to be more broadly accessed, which I think benefits researchers across the board. But we really want to make something that's sustainable, something that we can keep going for the long term, and that's why we're keen to experiment, to be able to find something that will work for us. So with that, I will conclude, and thank you all for your attention, and take any questions you may have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Donaldson, for that really engaging and interesting talk. Certainly lots of food for thought. We're going to move on now to talk by Dr. Monica Granados. And following Monica's talk, there'll be the opportunity for a Q&A discussion. So Dr. Granados is a policy advisor in the Communication and Open Science section in the Science and Technology branch of Environment Canada. She has a PhD in ecology from McGill University, where she discovered her passion to make science more accessible and transparent. She's also a recent graduate of the Frictionless Fellows Program. We're really excited to have you here today, Dr. Granados, and thank you for your time. And I'm keen to hear your perspective through your fellowships and training, and now through your seat in a government agency on this topic of open access.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Monica Granados. I am a policy advisor at Environment and Climate Change Canada. And I have the great privilege to work on open science and open science policy at Environment and Climate Change Canada, and get to contribute to open science policy in the government of Canada as a whole. So today I'm going to talk to you about this theme that we're exploring today, open access. How is Canada doing? But I'm going to give you the perspective from the government of Canada. I'm going to tell you a little bit about where open science sits in the government of Canada, what we are planning to do with open access in the government of Canada, as well as what we have accomplished over the last few years on open access and really open science as a whole in the government of Canada. So I'm not sure if everyone here is familiar with the fact that the government of Canada has scientists. So you may think that we know that universities have scientists and research institutions have scientists, but maybe you're not aware that we have federal scientists. In fact, according to Statistics Canada, in 2017 to 2018, there were approximately 35,000 full-time federal employees engaged in science and technology. So that's a lot of people working for the government of Canada that are doing science. About 1/3 of those 35,000 work in research and development. And it's really neat to have those individuals working on research and development, on science, on social science, because the research that our scientists do inform and guide policy. So the work that they do is then used to guide decisions that decision makers make in the government of Canada. In addition to, the research that gets done as well, all of that informs policy, but it's really neat to have specific individuals who work on the mandates of the different federal science departments and agencies. So when they produce results or ways to communicate their research, it can result in technical reports, but like the scientists in universities, they produce peer-reviewed publications. In fact, thousands of them. So how do we know how many publications we produce as the government of Canada? And what are we doing to make them more accessible? And that really is sort of the heart of the question that we're trying to address today is, so now we know the government of Canada has scientists who are producing a lot of publications, but what do we know about these publications and how many of them are open? So making our science accessible here at the Government of Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada is incredibly important. And addressing that question of knowing how accessible those research publications are, those peer-reviewed publications in particular, is anchored in the open science work we do at the Government of Canada. So to start off, the Government of Canada is committed to make federal science, scientific data, and scientists more accessible. So this includes peer-reviewed publications. So where does open science sit in the Government of Canada? It's anchored in the open government commitments. So the Open Government Commitment is a commitment that is part of the Open Government Partnership. There are many countries that are involved in this partnership, Canada being one of them. And every couple of years, the Government of Canada puts out a National Action Plan on Open Government. So this National Action Plan has several commitments. The last commitment had 10, or the last plan had 10 commitments. And they vary in the type of topic that they're addressing. So there are some aspects of the National Action Plan that touch on open justice. There are others that touch on open science. There's in fact an explicit open science commitment in the fourth National Action Plan on Open Government, which spans the years of 2018 to 2020. Later on, I'll talk about what we're doing since the fourth National Action Plan has reached its conclusion. So let me tell you a little bit about the open science commitment that is nestled inside the National Action Plan on Open Government. So the Open Science Commitment has several milestones aimed at making federal science more accessible, including developing a roadmap for open science and raising public awareness of federal scientists' work and of open science. The commitment also has a milestone to measure progress in implementing open science. And this is the really interesting part when it comes to us assessing what the progress is in terms of the federal government in implementing not only open science, but open access, which is is a component of open science. So through this mechanism, through this specific commitment, and then that given milestone, we can assess open access in federal peer-reviewed publications. It is the specific milestone that gives us the mandate or the power to go and investigate this very explicit question. So for us to answer that question of how many publications are federal scientists producing, how many of them are open, and what types of open access are they, we worked with Science Metrics to collect bibliometric data to assess this progress, to get a better idea of the landscape of federal peer-reviewed publications, but also specifically looking at that open access component. This work resulted in the Federal Progress in Implementing Open Science 2019 Annual Report. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about that report. The report contained several different indicators measuring the federal progress in implementing open science. So we were not just looking at open access, we were also looking at open data, as well as open maps and any other types of applications, public engagements, all things sort of surrounding open science. But an important component was that open access component. And I'm going to touch on that in the rest of this presentation. So what were the methods that we used to determine the answer to that question? How are we doing in terms of open access in the federal government? Well, to start off, our analysis focused only on peer-reviewed publications, and they had to be authored by federal scientists and science contributors. And we only looked at the date range of 2008 to 2017. Technical reports that were not published in peer-reviewed journals were not included. Again, we were trying to make sure that we focused on peer-reviewed journals. That also allowed us to then do comparisons across the federal science-based departments and agencies, but also across Canada, and then also across the world, because different institutions and different governments and different countries are all participating in the publication of peer-reviewed papers. So we also included peer-reviewed publications resulting from research funded by science-based departments and agencies, but they had to be authored by at least one federal scientist or science contributor. So if there wasn't at least one federal scientist or science contributor, they weren't included. And we used a combination of Scopus and the One Finder database to ascribe the federal authorship and open access status. So basically what we did is, using Scopus, we looked to see how, if a paper had an affiliation with a federal science-based department or agency. So for example, for Environment and Climate Change Canada, we went in and looked if any of the authors in any given paper had an affiliation with Environment and Climate Change Canada. Of course, we did some due diligence to ensure that there was many different spellings and iterations and affiliations that were associated with Environment and Climate Change Canada. And so that was a bulk of the work that we did in collaboration with Science Metrics. And if one of the authors was affiliated with one of the science-based departments and agencies, then it was considered a federal publication, and then was put into the pool of papers to then further consider its open access status. So we did that for all the papers in Scopus and then divided it by the different science-based departments and agencies. But today I'm just going to tell you, as the Government of Canada as a whole, what we found. So what are the results? So over that period that we looked at in 2008 and 2017, federal scientists published nearly 58,000 papers, or on average 5,800 per year. So there's a lot of science getting produced by the Government of Canada, a lot of science that is contributing not only to the knowledge base of any particular field, but also to the policy decisions that are happening at the Government of Canada. 49.2% of the federal scientific papers, again published from 2018 and 2017, are available in open access. So that includes gold and green open access. We didn't define it any lower than just gold and green. And the federal share of open access publications is 1.2% above the Canadian average and 8.5% above the world average. So what that is saying is that the number of open access publications relative to paywall publications is higher than the Canadian average. So if you just look at all of the papers published by Canadian authors, there's a smaller percentage that are available in open access. And if you compare it to all of the papers published across the world for that given time period, the federal government has a greater proportion of papers in open access. So here you'll see that the number of papers has been keeping pretty steady from the time period that we examined, so from 2008 to 2017. When we did this study back in 2019, there probably will still be some backfilling here, but we've got a relatively stable amount of papers with maybe perhaps a slight decrease towards 2017. What about specifically within open access? Well, we found that 31% of the open access publications were in gold, while 30% were in green OA. And that health and physics research, so research that is probably primarily done by science-based departments and agencies like Health Canada or the Public Health Agency of Canada, tends to have a relatively high gold open access and green open access levels, which is probably something that you'll see across the board for this type of research. And again, that's sort of just signaling the differences in culture of disciplines like physics and health research versus others where I think that trend is starting to change, but certainly physics is a field that is ahead of the curve when it comes to open access and open science in general. So this is a graph of the percentage of open access peer-reviewed publications for both the world, Canada, and then the federal. So federal government, federal mark here or denotation is for the federal government. So again, if you just looked at the entire database of Scopus, of papers in Scopus, for the world, there's approximately 40.7% of papers are open access, while in Canada, it's about 48.8 and 49.2% are available in open access where the author is a federal government scientist or science producer. When you look at gold OA and green OA, you see a similar pattern that across the world, the federal government is doing better in terms of the open access share than the world, both in gold and in green open access. So as I mentioned, this report has much more than just information about how we're doing in terms of open access. There's some information on open data efforts. There is a lot of really interesting information about like public engagement that the federal government is doing, because we consider that open science is not just about making your data and your publications open, but also the science more accessible. So that is something that we are trying to assess and to showcase. All of that information is available in the Federal Progress in Implementing Open Science 2019 report. It is freely available on Zenodo, and the DOI here will get you to this page, and you can download it, of course, for free. Okay, so I want to finish by talking a little bit about the next steps. So I've told you a little bit about where open science is in the government of Canada. And, showing that about, just under 50% of our papers are available in open access. Okay, well, what about that other half? What are we doing to make more of the science accessible, including making these publications freely available? Well, in February of 2020, the Roadmap for Open Science was published by the Office of the Chief Science Advisor. It has several recommendations, and one of those recommendations is a call for immediate open access of all federal peer-reviewed publications by January 2022. So that means moving that number from just under 50% to 100%. So the drive is there. We've got the recommendation to move from 50% to 100%. We're going to keep an eye on that number. So we're going to be publishing a 2020 version of the Federal Progress in Implementing Open Science report to see how that number has changed, and are we moving towards this recommendation of 100% open access publications. And we're also in the process of developing a 5th National Action Plan. It's being developed and headed by the Treasury Board Secretariat, but we've been involved in some of the public engagement sessions that they have held specifically on open science, and we'll see what the 5th National Action Plan will have in terms of commitments and milestones. But we look forward to continue to move forward in open science, continuing to increase the number of publications that are available in open access. And there's a lot of really interesting work that's happening in the federal government, and I look forward to continuing to talk to you about it and overall how we're making federal science more accessible to the public. So with that, I will take questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Michael and Monica, for these really fantastic talks. I really appreciate the time you've taken out of your day to give them to us. We've got lots of questions coming through in the chat, and please do add further questions if you have them. I'm going to just get right into them. So early on in the session, I think when Michael was speaking, we had a question about platinum and diamond open access. So the participants wondering whether or not perhaps, Michael, you could clarify if you're familiar with those and how they differ from bronze OpenA.
Yes, for sure. That's a great question, and I should have touched on that in my definitions as well. But I guess the platinum and diamond, I think they're kind of synonymous between the two terms, but they usually refer to immediate open access where the author doesn't have to pay a fee, and instead it's another funder. So in some cases it might be an academic society, like a scholarly society that supports the publication in the journal, or it might be a charitable organization, or it could be I guess even funding that's coming from another source like government, for example. So it's usually sort of that same idea as gold open access, where it's immediate and free open access, where the author doesn't have to pay and the funding is coming from another source. And just in contrast to the bronze example, the bronze open access, all these precious metals kind of have these strange definitions, but for the bronze OA, it's more, it's the same kind of idea really as the platinum and the diamond, but instead of it being a third-party funder, it's usually the publisher themselves that are making that content available. Sometimes that happens after an embargo period, or sometimes that happens immediately just if the publisher makes that content freely available. The only sort of catch with the bronze OA is it's not always accompanied with a CC BY type license. Sometimes it's just made freely accessible.
Great. Thanks so much for that explanation. I think that really clarifies it for folks. Okay, so COVID has taught us many things. One is that we need to learn how to pivot and adapt. So in the context of today's session, we're having some tech issues with getting Monica online. So I actually have her here on my phone on speaker, and I'm going to pose the next question to Monica, and hopefully you'll be able to hear her response. So one of our participants has asked Monica, how can we show the government and funding agencies that open access is important? So interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, hi, great question. I'm going to try to speak loud to see if people can hear me. I think one way is to participate in some of the engagement sessions that are happening, that are either being hosted by Environment and Climate Change Canada or by the Treasury Board Secretariat. So I'm not sure if I think they're done with the live sessions, but the Treasury Board Secretariat was doing some engagement sessions in service of putting together the 5th National Action Plan, and I think they still have some of their input forms available on their website. Environment and Climate Change Canada is also almost done with all of our engagement sessions. So, but there are opportunities that will come up this way. And, you know, another thing you can always do, you can always reach out to, you know, your member of parliament or anyone who's involved in government and telling them that this is something that's important to you. You can always exercise that right as well. Excellent, and I'd encourage folks to do that, because I think it's an important question. You know, how are we going to get this sort of as a priority for Canada and beyond? Okay, there's lots of good questions here, and they keep coming in. I see two that kind of are a bit similar, and maybe we'll go first to Michael and see sort of his thoughts on this. So one of the folks here has asked, you know, as a student in the situation of wanting to publish open access, but either their supervisor has no funds or there's no means to afford the article processing charges where those exist, what would you suggest for them?
That's a great question, and I think there's a lot of folks, even myself, I'm kind of an independent researcher now, and there's a lot of folks in that same position, students, budgets that have smaller funding grants, and OA publishing is expensive, especially with that gold open access model where it's, the author pays APC. Now there are some alternatives to that, and I think one option is the green open access route. So if you're publishing in a journal that enables you to post the accepted version of your manuscript, you can post that freely. You can put it in a repository. You can share that through your own personal website or your lab's website. You can get that version out there. It's also searchable in most major databases as well, so it helps with discovery. The other option might be to look at preprint servers as well, and in some cases, some journals have certain policies that may not allow for preprints, but most are getting increasingly lenient and are actually kind of encouraging the deposit of preprint versions of your paper as well. So I'd say, if you can try and choose a journal that has more liberal options for getting your paper out there, either in a preprint or in a repository, I think that's one way to get there at no additional cost, and it's a fairly simple process to be able to do that. And I think it does help with discovery, and helps with citations as well. So definitely something to explore.
I agree. I think that those are great options. I'm wondering, Monica, if you have anything to add to Michael's response.
Yeah, I would just add that there, it could be confusing to know what the policies, especially when it comes to like preprints and what preprint version is accepted at the different journals. One option, of course, is you can read the publishers' agreements of the different publishing houses, or there are resources that have centralized that information. So you can check out Sherpa Romeo that has put together that information for you, or the Transpose project from ASAP Bio. So that may help you determine whether the publication the journal that you intend to publish in allows preprints, and what version of the preprint as well.
Great, thank you for that. I'm looking here, and there seems to be a couple questions specific to each of you. So maybe, Monica, I'll stick with you for a minute and ask you, someone has asked, is there a common repository that most federal scientists use for green open access, or do they mostly use their discipline-specific repositories?
Yeah, good question. We don't have a huge grasp on that. We're in the process of doing some consultation with our scientists to find out the types of repositories that they are using. So I would say that it's a combination of those. And there are we're in the early explorations of looking for whether or not there's a potential solution to have a federal repository that scientists can use. So it's sort of like a mix right now.
Yeah, it would be interesting to have something centralized like that. Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on. I've got a few more questions here. So this is a question specifically for you, Michael. They're wondering, are Canadian publishers planning to make accessible legacy scientific publications? So publications that have been published, for instance, a decade or more ago, but are still not currently open access?
Yeah, I think it's it probably varies on a per publisher and per journal basis, but I know even at CSP we have some of our back content that we do make available after a certain time period, and I think that there's kind of a growing movement towards doing that, because obviously there's a lot of great content that's kind of held back in publishers' back catalogs that would benefit from being more widely available. So I don't know across the board like how common it is to make that sort of a publisher type policy where previously published content can be made accessible, but I know it's definitely something that is a bit more common, and hopefully as time goes on and we're moving more to these transformative type approaches, hopefully that will also include some of that legacy content as well, to make sure that that folks are able to access that.
That would be great. I've done some reading and related to COVID and what COVID researchers currently publishing COVID studies, what they cite and how much of that is behind a paywall, and it's a significant proportion. Okay, so there's another question here from one of our Journalology team members, Greg Bryson, and he's asking whether you guys could comment on the relative contribution of open access publishing and preprints in disseminating science and meeting broader open access goals. So maybe Monica, we'll start with you there. So thoughts on how the relative contribution of open access publishing and preprints.
Yeah, interestingly, we don't know. So when we did this analysis, we only looked at articles that were like the version of record. So even if we were looking at green open access, it would only be like the version of record. So we weren't looking at preprint uptake. So I don't actually know what that contribution is. I would say that preprints are probably still a pretty novel thing in the government of Canada. However, we're looking at them as one of the potential solutions for the call for 100% open access. And I think preprints have a lot of potential when it comes to meeting that recommendation of 100% open access in a way that's also economical to the government.
Excellent, thank you. Michael, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think Monica's answer was great. I guess one other thing that's maybe sort of just playing off that question a little bit is there's been a bit of a movement towards more integration between preprint servers and publishing platforms and journals. And I know one thing that was put forward a few years ago was a partnership between bioRxiv and PLOS One, where if you submitted a paper to bioRxiv, the preprint server, then your paper could be transferred over to the journal and vice versa as well. And actually at CSP, we're exploring a similar partnership with bioRxiv now as well. So it may, I guess maybe over time, we might actually see more of a blurred line between preprints and journals as we get more and more integration that way. So yeah, I don't have any more specifics on Greg's question, but yeah, I think it's definitely something that's kind of changing and becoming more and more integrated, I think.
Great, thank you both for those comments. I think Michael will definitely look forward to see sort of how that moves forward at Canadian Science Publishing. We know certainly like journals like F1000 have moved in that direction to really integrate with preprint servers. Okay, I think we just have one last question, or time for one last question, and it's a question I think directed primarily to you, Michael, and it's about this participant wants to hear more about different kinds of transformative agreements that Canadian Science Publishing is exploring.
Yes, for sure. So yeah, we, I guess about 2 years ago, we undertook sort of this scoping exercise to look at some of the transformative models that are being taken up by other publishers. And we're kind of in a unique position, I guess, because we're not huge in terms of the publishing world. We're big within Canada, I guess, but on a global scale, we're definitely a smaller publisher. So we wanted to find a solution that would work well for us and for our partners. So we've been exploring a couple different types. There's sort of read and publish type models and publish and read. There's another model called subscribe to open as well, and they all sort of have different different approaches that kind of arrive at that same goal to make content that was previously subscription based more and more open and more accessible. So at the moment, we're actually undertaking a pilot project. We're about to start. It's something that's kind of being worked on in behind the scenes right now. That will take sort of a read and publish type approach, and we're starting with one sort of consortium, like a group of institutions that we're working with, and we have a couple others that are sort of lined up that we're looking to establish partnerships with later this year and beyond. And our goal is really to test out different types of models. The read and publish approach kind of works well for us, I think, but we want to be able to experiment, and that's sort of the goal behind having this pilot, where we set up sort of measures that we'd use to determine our success, and we track them over time and see if we can get there. So it's exciting for us to be able to explore and play around with these different possibilities, and yeah, I think we'll have more to report probably within the next few months.
Great. That sounds really interesting. I think I'll definitely be keen to follow that, as I know many others would. I think your point, just to conclude, I think really relates to sort of open science implementation more broadly. There's a lot of piloting, testing, sort of audit and feedback that we need to do to try to see if we can roll things out and measure how we're doing and modify if needed. I see we're at 1 o'clock exactly, so I'll stop questions there. Certainly, I think if you have further questions, you can reach out to our center at journalology@ohri.ca or to either Michael or Monica directly. I just want to end by thanking you both for your time today. It's really great to have you with us and to talk about open access in the Canadian lens, and especially from your different perspectives. So thank you both, and tune in next time. We'll have more information about our third session in the speaker series, which will be on preprints, and we'll get a date to you soon. So we'll stop there and thank you again.
Thank you.